going to say hi to the folks that are out there in this other spaceship floating through space simultaneously with us here. My name is Megan Curzons. I'm with the Cumberland Community Forest Society. This is day 2 of Fungus Fest in the time of COVID. We're experimenting with all kinds of things. I mean, a Fungus Fest would be experimental at the best of times, but it's even more interesting as we're navigating the rules around coming together. So we've got a great combination of people who are here and really excited to be here, and then all of you back at home. And we're going to see how this goes. I'm going to try and zoom in on some mushrooms for you, but mostly, ooh, there we go. Someone saying, I didn't know you were just down the street. They're seeing our secret location. Shh. Okay, if you are within a 1-block radius of this location, you could show up. That's what I'm going to say. All right.
Especially if they've got pizza.
If you have pizza, yeah, or apparently dark beer. Both those things will work. Amanda and Sarah out there at the front, and they are taking bribes, but only if you have proof of address. Hybrid. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Andy MacKinnon. Andy was the first person we asked to take part, and he had committed. So we made sure he kept that on the calendar, and then we kind of transformed this whole event to look more like what we're doing. He was still along for the ride, and for that, I am very grateful. Whenever we asked who we needed to have for our first Fungus Fest, Andy MacKinnon's name is the first one that came up, and so I'm feeling pretty honored that he chose to make this a priority this weekend, and really excited to introduce him to you. So, oh, there we go, Andy and Shannon Rock. So without further ado, I'm going to shut down my screen and I'll zoom in when we're looking at mushroom samples, and I will pass it over to Here we go. Awesome.
Thank you, Megan. And so a few years ago, I started thinking, you know, fungi are fabulous. They're just terrific. Plants are wonderful. I love studying plants. But really, some of the most interesting things out there are plants and fungi together. Why should you be limited to studying one group or the other? When I studied fungi, they were, well, in a lot of cases, still are taught in botany departments. And really, in the 70s, there were still textbooks out there that described fungi as a kind of a degraded plant. And really, nothing could be further from the truth. Plants and fungi are very different. They're different kingdoms of life. The plants, the fungi are very close in a lot of ways with animals. Biochemically, phylogenetically, evolutionarily, fungi and animals are fairly close. And neither of them are at all related to plants. In just about any way you could think of. And this comes as a surprise for most people. But what it means, for example, is that if I was looking at this fungus here, this is much more closely related, way more closely related to the people in the room here than it is to any plant, right? And fungi and plants are in a lot of ways obvious partners. They have all kinds of associations, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight until about 6 o'clock. And I'm going to start off by talking about a few bad relationships. Has anybody in this room or online ever had a bad relationship? Put your hand up. Yeah. Okay. But most of the talk is going to be about the wonderful collaborations between plants and fungi. I'm not going to talk an awful lot about the association between plant roots and fungi, which is called a mycorrhiza or fungus root, because that's the topic of Shannon Birch's talk after this. But I will touch on it as one of those sorts of relationships. But plants and fungi really are obvious partners, and they are the reason that the world looks the way it does. And if you don't believe that now, we'll see if you believe it a little bit more by the time we get to be 6 o'clock. Okay. I didn't hesitate to come up here when I was invited by Megan because I'm such a fan of the work that the Cumberland Community Forest does. It's a brilliant community initiative that I have heard great admiration for by communities all up and down the east side of Vancouver Island who wish that they had, and in the southern Gulf Islands, who wish that they had something like what the Cumberland Community Forest Association has been able to deliver to your community here. It's wonderful fungal habitat. It's wonderful plant habitat. Some people even cycle through it, but I don't care too much about that. But the reason that we have forests around here is because the trees have fungi associated with their roots. If there was a way to remove those fungi, and this has been shown in laboratories, it's rather difficult to do out in the real world. But if it were possible to remove these fungi, all of the trees and most of the other plants would disappear. Okay? Fungi and plants have a long-standing relationship. And that's because plants, almost alone among living organisms, can make their own food. They can photosynthesize, they can use the energy of the sun to produce sugars and carbohydrates. And just about every other group of organisms on Earth, including fungi, depend on the food produced by the plants. And that's in some ways, with all the examples I'll give, the benefit that the fungi derive from the plants. And in the different groups I'm going to talk about here, the fungi deliver different things to the plants. One of them that I'll come back to in a little while is this association between the roots of plants and fungi. Now, you know it's important because of the vascular plants out there, that is the plants that have little tubes in them to move water and sugars around. Just about everything out there except for the mosses and liverworts. About, well, over 90, perhaps 94% of vascular plant species on Earth have fungi associated with their roots. Okay. For the math challenge in our group tonight, 94% is almost all. There's a few odd groups that lack these fungal associations, and sometimes we don't know why. Groups like the mustard family. Other groups, it's a little more obvious. Aquatic plants generally don't have these fungal associations, but that's because the roots are submerged in water, and the fungi would have to live in an environment without oxygen. But almost all of these plants have the fungi, and if you take the plants individually into the laboratory and you remove these fungi from their roots, the plants will die. That means if there was some way to remove the fungi from the roots of the plants in the forest here, we wouldn't have any forests anymore. All right, so it's not only ubiquitous, but it's critically important. And you can see that. Oh, by the way, because we've got a small group here, because I'm not using a PowerPoint or anything like that, for the people in this group here, feel free to interrupt if I say anything that's confusing or if it raises any questions with you, okay? Don't save your questions till the end, because if I say something that you find confusing, probably other people are also confused and are just sitting there thinking, I bet I'm the only one who's confused. Well, yes. Sure. Now I promised Shannon, who's a good friend, who's giving the next talk, that I wouldn't dwell too much on mycorrhizae, but no. What, for example, one project that was done when I worked out of Prince George in a clear-cut area, it was planted with seedlings that had no fungi associated with their roots. You can grow them that way in a nursery if you keep the nitrogen levels high enough. And by the end of the first growing season, 100% of the seedlings had fungi associated with their roots. Okay? So it happens naturally. But you can see it in the fact that the first land plants had fungi associated with their roots, the fossils of the first land plants. That's probably how those plants managed to make it onto land. And we can see it throughout the fossil record, right back to the very first land plants. So an important association. There are good associations and bad associations, and most of tonight's talk is going to be on the really interesting symbioses, or situations where plants and fungi grow together. Plants in the forests can be parasites. They can live on other living organisms. This is a good example here. This is the woolly pine spike, Progopistolmentosis, or the fruiting body of it. This is a fungus that's part of a group of fungi that always seem to fruit in forests with conifers. Okay, and so for many, many years, we assumed that that was because the fungus was associated with the roots of conifers. In fact, for this and some of its close relatives, it's actually a much more interesting association. So this woolly pine spike here, it is a handsome mushroom. This woolly pine spike here, and some of its close relatives are actually parasites of some boletes. There's a group of boletes called the slippery jacks in the genus Suillus. And they're called slippery jacks because they tend to have slippery caps. But it turns out that the fungal threads in the soil associated with this fungus parasitize the fungal threads in the soil of the slippery jacks. And the reason that this one is always associated with conifers is not because it's growing attached to the roots of the conifers, but because it's a parasite of another fungus that's growing attached to the roots of the conifers. Okay. One of the neat things about mycology is that we're still learning some fundamentally new things all the time. It's a real cutting edge field to work in. Yeah. Nope. No, there's a number of plants that I'm going to talk about later on that lack chlorophyll. Oh, yeast is a basidiomycete in just about any way you could think of. Oh, sorry, it's a fungus. It's a fungus. Yeast are fungi. There are some ascomycete yeasts, but yeah. Okay, so parasites. So that's there are some fungi like the one that produces this fruiting body, the Dyer's polypore, which people here who dye fabric will be familiar with, or the red belt conch, that decay wood in trees. And some of them are parasites. Some of them are classed as saprobes because they generally live on decaying organic matter. And some of them do both. So they can parasitize a live tree, kill it, and then continue to grow on the dead tree.
A quick request is when someone from the audience asks a question, can you repeat the question a bit? Because the folks out there can't hear the question.
Right. So the request was, if I get a question from somebody in the audience, can I repeat it? Wasn't that a good example of what you asked for? And then there's some really confusing examples, such as this fungus here, the red belt conch, that are decayers of heartwood of conifers. So the conifers have heartwood in the center of the stem, and the heartwood is dead. It's dead material. So if you are decaying the heartwood in a living conifer, are you a saprobe or a parasite? And it's about that time that my head usually explodes and I give up and realize that these are kind of artificial boundaries that we're trying to impose upon them. So not all of these relationships are really positive in nature. We do have parasites, we do have saprobes, and they both play important roles in forest ecosystems. Most of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is symbioses, where they're living together in seemingly, in most of the time, mutually beneficial associations. But I also wanted to throw in a puffball, just because the genus name is Lycoperdon, which means wolf fart. That's the sole reason I included that in the talk tonight. It has nothing to do with the topic. So the first group I want to talk about is lichens. And lichens come in all shapes and forms. There are more species of macrofungi, large fungi, in British Columbia than there are species of vascular plants. So the fungi are an incredibly rich group, but there are more species of lichens than there are species of either of those two groups. Okay, so this is from a biodiversity point of view, from so many different points of view, lichens are fascinating organisms. And sometimes they look like long hair hanging from trees. Sometimes they're very brightly colored. Sometimes we get lung lichens hanging from the trees, certainly in older forests, that represent a fungus and an alga and a cyanobacterium all growing in the same organism. So the alga is a plant, the cyanobacterium, what some people would call a blue-green alga, is a bacterium. And so you have three kingdoms of life growing in some lichens, which is a truly extraordinary thing for a biologist. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is just plants and fungi, but some of these lichens, especially ones that are most common and some that are even restricted to old growth forests in British Columbia, have three kingdoms of life in them, with a fungus that makes up most lichens, an alga or a plant that can photosynthesize and produce the sugars, and in the case of these lichens with the cyanobacteria, a cyanobacterium as well, which can pull nitrogen out of the air, what's called fixing nitrogen, making it available in these oftentimes nitrogen limited ecosystems. What a factory, what a package, right? And they really are some of the species only found in British Columbia, so far as we know, in old growth forests. So if you're looking for old growth dependent species, forget those silly owls and those silly murrelets. We should be looking at the cyanolichens. Lichens were first described as composite organisms. That is a plant and a fungus growing together about 140 years ago. And it was about 7 years ago that researchers working in British Columbia found that it was actually way more interesting than that. Toby Schrebeli and associates, looking at lichens, they were trying to figure out why these two lichens, these two types of horsehair lichen, which are brown lichens that look like hair hanging down, why they had the same fungus and the same alga, same species in two of them, but they were completely different chemically. And in fact, one was called the edible horsehair lichen and was an important food for some Southern Interior First Nations, and the other was called the inedible horsehair lichen. Now, I've eaten the edible horsehair lichen, and it's largely inedible. But anyway, these are chemically quite different species with the same fungus and the same alga. And what Toby and others found was that there were, in fact, at least two fungi involved, and probably more, and that it was better to think of these lichens as ecosystems rather than as partnerships. Some of them are differentiated because they have different bacterial populations within the same fungus and the same alga. So I think we're just starting the second, with molecular genetics becoming more accessible, we're just starting the second wave of trying to truly understand what these lichens are all about. Very exciting times in lichenology. The work that Toby and others did with the horsehair lichens was really the most exciting thing to happen in about 140 years since Simon Schwendenner first suggested these were composite organisms and had everybody yell nasty things at him. That was in the late 19th century. Okay, so that's one type of partnership. The second one I wanted to talk about is fungal endophytes. And I say that because we're going to sing a tune about fungal endophytes a little bit later. So not to be too frightened away, let's parse the phrase out. Endophytes are things that live inside plants. Endophytes. So fungal endophytes are fungi that live inside plants. All right. One of the more interesting aspects of this started in the 1980s in British Columbia, before we knew very much about fungal endophytes outside of grasses. And that was that we had a bit of a mini gold rush in especially southern Vancouver Island and the West Kootenays, with people gathering Western yew. It was discovered in the 1980s that if you extracted the bark of Western yew, you could get a compound that was called parataxol. But anyway, the commercial name for it is Taxol. And it was pretty soon recognized through clinical trials that this was one of the most effective chemotherapeutic agents against ovarian and breast cancers, and is still used for that purpose till today. And there was a bit of a gold rush in British Columbia with people stripping the bark off Western yew trees and selling it to Bristol-Myers Squibbs in the United States. And it wiped out Western yew from some parts of its range in the West Kootenays and on southern Vancouver Island. And it's fortunately coming back, because in the early 1990s, they figured out how to produce it in other ways, and the market fell apart. You can imagine all those people out getting rich stripping bark off yew trees. That's probably one of the best ways to kill it. And it can now be largely synthesized without yew trees involved at all, and is still used in treatment of various types of cancers. Well, about probably, I think it was about 6 years ago now, some researchers in Europe were looking at European yew, a closely related species of Taxus. And they isolated from the twigs and leaves of European yew over 200 species of fungi growing inside European yew without producing any signs of parasitism or anything like that. They just seemed to be growing there. Nobody was quite sure what they were doing, but it was rather extraordinary that you could look at a species like Western yew and find more than 200 species of fungi growing inside it without producing any symptoms. Turns out that 2 of the species of fungi, of these fungal endophytes that were isolated from European yew, produce Taxol. So it seems that it's almost certainly not the Western yew itself that's producing the Taxol, but the fungi that are growing inside it. Fascinating, not surprising really, given that the fungi are much more effective and inventive chemical factories than plants ever are. But it leads me to wonder how many of the chemicals that we associate with particular plant species are actually produced by the fungi that are growing inside them, by their fungal endophytes. To date, every single plant that anybody's looked at for fungal endophytes has had fungi growing inside it. And that includes not just vascular plants, but non-vascular plants like mosses and liverworts. There are fungal endolichens, so fungi growing asymptotically, like without symptoms, inside lichens. And there are bacterial endophytes, and there are viral endophytes. And some of the fungal endophytes have bacterial and viral endofungi fights. All of which means that things are way more interesting than anybody had ever imagined, in a way that is ubiquitous. 100% of plant species sampled so far, and sometimes incredibly diverse. Plants, what are these fungal endophytes up to? Trying to sort that out. So there are researchers beavering away at that. There's been a lot of work done in grasses, where it's been shown that if you can grow plants without fungal endophytes, the grasses are much less productive and much less palatable, and the animals that graze them are much less productive as well. Some of the fungal endophytes almost certainly produce toxins that make the plants less attractive to animals that want to graze them. And beyond that, who knows? Maybe some of them are just living happily away inside the plants, eating the sugars that the plants produce, and living their fungal lives. These fungi are transmitted sometimes vertically, as it's said, from a plant to its seeds. So some plants, when they produce their seeds, the seeds have fungal endophytes in them. And some are transmitted horizontally, we know, by insects or by fungal spores landing on other plants. Fascinating, fungal endophytes. So I thought, why don't we sing a song about fungal endophytes? So if you could share here, that would be great. And for those of you at home, I apologize on screen. I guess we can't make this visible to the, can we? Okay, if you take one of those sheets, that sounds good. Let's give that a try. And we want everybody singing here, but if you feel inclined to sing at home too, why, that would be dandy. Okay, let's see if we can do this here. So here is almost certainly one of the best songs about fungal endophytes. I feel it in my branches, I feel it in my roots. Endophytes are in me, from my flowers to my fruit. It's written on the wind, which is always full of spores. I'd be in my tissues, who could ask for more? You know that fungi, they help me thrive. Without my endophytes, I don't feel alive. There's no beginning, there'll be no end. On endophytes, I can depend. Sorry, Clavicipitaceous means it grows with grass. Clavicipitaceous, that means they grow with grass. Endophytes, they help me grow as I increase my mass. Phytophagous insects, the fungi do deter. So many other benefits the endophytes confer. From the horsetail, oh no, there's fun to help me thrive. Without my endophytes, I don't feel alive. There's no beginning, there'll be no end. On endophytes, I can depend. From the horsetails to the seagrass and all the bryophytes, to the mighty Douglas fir, they all love endophytes. The fungi, thank you. Ubiquitous. So if you really love endophyte, why don't you sing with us? Fungi, they help me thrive. Without my endophytes, I don't feel alive. There's no beginning, there'll be no end. On endophytes, I can depend. I feel it in my branches. I feel it in my roots. The endophytes are in me, from my flowers to my fruits. It's written on the wind, always full of spores. I be in my tissue, who could ask for more? Oh, very good, very good, very good. Okay. Yes, I did, as a matter of fact. That's not okay. Good. So we don't need that. Oh, thank you. Ah, much safer. Good, good, good. All right. So fungal endophytes. I also wanted to talk about mycorrhizae very briefly, and then I want to talk about. Oh, sorry, I don't want to steal Elle's pick here. Wanted to talk about mycorrhizae very briefly because Shannon's going to talk about them soon, but they are the most famous of the fungal plant associations. I mentioned more than 90%, by some accounts, 94% of vascular plant species have fungi associated with their roots. And you'll learn a lot more about that in the next hour with Shannon. And for me, it's really changed the way I think about how forests function. So occasionally in your life, you may run across moments when the way you view the world changes fundamentally. And mycorrhizae did that to me. So we had a study in the Victoria watershed that we finished up a few years ago that was looking at the fungi associated with the roots of older Douglas fir trees in these association. So the association, as Shannon will explain, is called a mycorrhiza, or fungus root. It's the fungus associated with the root. And there's different kinds of mycorrhiza, and she'll explain all about the different kinds of mycorrhiza. And the way it's illustrated in books, you usually have a plant and you have a fungus, and the plant photosynthesizes. It does what plants do. It makes food, sends the food down to its roots. That's how the fungus is fed. The fungus has filaments out through the soil, gathers water and minerals, brings it back to the plant, and that's the nature of the relationship, and everybody lives happily ever after. Of course, the world doesn't work that way very often, or probably never. And what we found in this study in the watershed is that each Douglas fir tree we looked at had somewhere between 12 and 16 different fungi associated with its roots, different species of fungi. There were probably more than that we didn't find, but 12 to 16 would be a kind of a minimum associated with the roots of these older Douglas fir trees. There have been more than 2,000 species of fungi that have been known to associate with the roots of Douglas fir. It's really the world champion in terms of the fungi associated with it. But most of the fungi that are associated with the roots of a Douglas fir tree would be associated with the roots of multiple trees. So you have each tree with multiple fungi, and each of these fungi connected to multiple trees. And what you end up with is not a tree and its fungus, but an actual web of underground connections connecting all of the trees in the entire stand directly or indirectly, and moving materials through the fungal hyphae from one tree to another. And Shannon will talk a lot more about that. But for some aspects of the way this wood wide web functions, it looks like rather than the classic plant ecologist view of the world, at least in North America, of everything being based on competition and winners and losers, that there's an awful lot more collaboration and cooperation going on in our forests than anybody ever gave the systems credit for. And it really changes the way you think about forests. I can't say any more without cutting into Shannon's time. But I do want to talk about one last group and then leave a little bit of time for a few questions at the end and still finish up by 6 o'clock, which is what I promised to do. The last group I want to talk about is Mycoheterotrophs. Okay. Again, we'll parse the word out. An autotroph is something that can make its own food, like a plant is an autotroph. A heterotroph is something that can't make its own food, like you, say, or me. We are heterotrophs. Some plants are heterotrophs. They can't make their own food. Why would a plant be a heterotroph, do you think? We had the suggestion from the gentleman in the back row there earlier on. Lack of chlorophyll, exactly. So some plants lack chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is the compound that the plants use to catalyze the power of sunlight to manufacture sugars. So if you lack chlorophyll, you're a plant, but you are not an autotroph. You are a plant which is a heterotroph. You cannot make your own food. And I think if you think about it, you'll be familiar with some of these plants. They usually, if you're walking in the woods and you see one, you usually go, "Holy Christmas!" That's well, you probably wouldn't say "Holy Christmas," but you'd be astonished. So, what might some examples be? Do you think of these mycoheterotrophs? No, a pitcher plant is more of an insectivorous plant. Yeah, yeah. There is a class, yes, absolutely, yes. Like ghost pipe. Yes, so ghost pipe is the most common example of one of these plants lacking chlorophyll that would grow in the woods around here. But there's lots of them. There's the candy stick. There's all the coral root orchids. There's the gnome plant. Pine sap. There's a number of orchids, including the phantom orchid, are all examples of these plants, green plants which aren't green, basically. And most guidebooks will tell you that they derive their nutrition instead from decaying organic matter, that they are saprophytes. Okay, that's not true. It's actually way more interesting than that and related to these associations between plants and fungi that I was telling you about. If I was giving this presentation on PowerPoint, I have an illustration of how the association works, but it's a really ugly illustration. So I think we might be better off if we could get 3 volunteers here up to the front, socially distanced. Or yeah, let's take 3 people from this group here who don't need to be socially distanced. So we need 1 person to play the role of the mycoheterotroph. This is going to demonstrate how the system works. And I think the person, yes, good. I was going to go for you because the person playing the mycoheterotroph has to be kind of white or pinkish and rather ethereally beautiful. So this is good. So far so good. Now we need someone to play the role of the Douglas fir tree, and they should be rather large and robust, but ever so slightly clueless. Do we have someone? Oh, they pointed at you. I mean, it's okay. That's great. That's great. Thank you very much. And then we need someone to play the role of the mycorrhizal fungus, and that would be someone who is kind of behind the scenes. You rarely notice them, but they're really quite controlling. Is there someone from this group like that? Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, the Douglas fir tree has a has mycorrhizal fungi, has fungi associated with his roots, right? So you, the fungus, can be associated with his root, maybe grab his ankle or something like that. You're associated with his root. So he's photosynthesizing, sending sugars down and feeding you. But like most mycorrhizal fungi, you're attached to the roots of a number of different plants. And in this case, actually, you're going to have to shift over a bit because you're also attached to the root of the Mycoheterotroph. Yeah, in the middle would be good. Yeah, you're attached to the roots of both. So the Mycoheterotrophs, these non-green plants, have mycorrhizal fungi, like more than 90% of plants. And in this kind of situation, the Douglas fir tree is photosynthesizing. So you need your branches up if you're going to photosynthesize. Okay, good. You're sending sugars down to your roots, which is helping feed the fungus. But the fungus is also transferring some of those sugars over to the non-green plant. And that is how the mycoheterotroph derives his nutrition. Okay. Now, if you could just work the system for a second here. So photosynthesize, send those sugars down. Come on. That's good. Okay, and move those sugars across. Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's an excellent demonstration. So that's how mycoheterotrophs work. Now, mycorrhizal fungi in general, including the mycorrhizal fungi involved in this kind of a relationship, are really important in the forest around here. You don't see them most of the year, but every large mushroom that you find in the woods around here, and some of the smaller ones as well, is the fruiting body of a fungus growing attached to the root of a tree. I can only think of one foraged autumn mushroom, at least around here, that is not the fruiting body of a mycorrhizal fungus. And that would be the honey mushroom, which is a parasite. But all of the rest, your chanterelles, your pine mushrooms, your boletes, your hedgehogs, these are all the fruiting bodies of fungi growing attached to the roots of trees, right? And some of them, like this one here, this is the ubiquitous short-footed russula, which is very abundant in the woods these days. Among other things, when it's parasitized by a species of hypomyces, this is the mushroom that becomes the lobster mushroom. It's this mushroom parasitized by an ascomycete fungus. But this is also the fungus whose fruiting body this is also almost always in British Columbia and the whole Pacific Northwest, the fungus associated with the roots of the ghost pipe. And you can sometimes see that relationship. Keep your eyes open for it in the autumn if you're out in the woods. These non-green plants usually disappear after they've flowered and set fruit. But the ghost pipe doesn't. It sticks around in clusters in the woods. It turns black and its capsules are up and you can find them in bunches. And I'm willing to bet that when you find clusters of these ghost pipes in the woods in the autumn, if you look around, more often than not, you'll find fruiting bodies of the short-footed russula nearby. And now you know why, right? Because the mycorrhizal fungi associated with the roots of the trees here are so important for the trees, they're also important for producing the foraged foods in the woods around here, which I'm sure a lot of people here are interested in. I certainly am. So if you're interested in things like hedgehog mushrooms and chanterelles and boletes and pine mushrooms, you have to maintain those mycorrhizal associations. And it's not a complex thing to do. You just have to avoid cutting down the trees. I think people here may be familiar. When you cut down the trees, your favorite mushrooms disappear. And that brings us right around to where I started with praising the exceptional work that the Cumberland Community Forest does in helping to make sure that that these trees around your community remain vertical rather than horizontal and continue to provide habitat for our fungal friends. Thanks. promise I will. So, what, 5 minutes? 5 or 10? Sure. And if anybody, maybe if anybody online has questions, is there a way they could type it into the Zoom thing and one of you could just repeat them? Okay. So who have I confused here? Excellent. I will. Right.
Megan, please unmute yourself.
Well, you are producing food from energy that you got from plants. Yes. Or from energy that you got from meat that got its energy from eating plants. There are, for example, cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, which can also photosynthesize. So it's not, strictly speaking, only plants that can produce their own food. And there are also some generally extremophile organisms that can chemosynthesize their own food rather than using sunlight as an energy source. Find them around hydrothermal vents and things like that. But for the most part, plants are the ones that make the food, and the rest of us are the ones that benefit from it, including their fungal partners in the examples tonight. Yes. So the question is, are morels mycelial? And what seems to, by mycelial, I'm assuming mycorrhizal. In other words, do they grow attached to the roots of trees, the fungi that produce morels? And the answer seems to be some are and some aren't. So it's usually with groups of fungi, they're either mycorrhizal or they're not. But some of the morels are clearly mycorrhizal, and some of them are clearly not, and others we're not quite sure. What this means from a practical point of view is if a fungus is mycorrhizal with trees, it means you can't easily cultivate it and sell it in the stores. You have to have trees in order to produce it, which is why it's so wonderful to go out and forage for wild mushrooms, because the mushrooms that we love are the fruiting bodies of fungi growing attached to the roots of trees, and you can't grow them on a farm. You have to go out to the woods to find them. However, some of, and it probably also explains why morels fruit in abundance following forest fires. Some of the morels that fruit in abundance following forest fires we know to be mycorrhizal species. And they may very well be fruiting in abundance because their host tree has been killed by the forest fire. And it's one last chance to get their spores out there. But there are morels that are not mycorrhizal, which means they can be cultivated. And the Chinese, among others, Koreans also are cultivating morels now in agricultural systems in the same way that people cultivate button mushrooms. So morels are both. Some are mycorrhizal, some are not. Thanks, Bonnie and Jonathan. That's a good question and gave me a chance to talk a lot about morels. I love morels. Hi, Brittany. Ah, thank you, Brittany. Yes, I was moving much too quickly. Most lichens do not have cyanobacteria associated with them. A smaller number of lichens have cyanobacteria associated with them. They're generally called cyanolichens, and they're not all old growth associates, but some of them certainly are in genera like Loberia, for example. There are species that we have yet to find in second growth forests. Part of that is that some of those canopy cyanolichens are very poorly distributed. They don't distribute themselves very much. And it may just very well, they can't grow in very young trees because the trees are growing too quickly, so they need a more stable substrate. So they need time for the trees' growth to slow down, and then after that they need time just because it takes time for them to reproduce. Generally, they're reproducing by fragmentation. If you think about it, if you're a composite organism like a lichen, reproduction is not a simple matter, right? If you want to generate a new lichen, that new lichen has to have the lichen components together in it. So it's oftentimes difficult and takes a long time for them to reproduce. But yeah, most lichens are not cyanolichens, but the ones that are really interesting.
I'm going to try and unmute myself and put my screen, and then I'll mute when you start talking again. Two is that one person had said, "Oh, you should do a full day workshop because so many have been canceled and they'd love to see one." So maybe we can talk about that. Maybe we can get an online workshop happening something over the winter. And then there was also just a question that popped up, and then I have a question that will probably pop up. The last one was mycorrhizal fungi produce annually, semi-annual. We don't know. That's Brittany as well.
So thank you, Brittany. So the question is, do the mycorrhizal fungi reproduce annually, semi-annually, whatever? And that's very much dependent on the species. A lot of the fungi associated with the mycorrhizae of plants in the pine family, that is, our hemlocks, true firs, Douglas firs around here, they're primarily ectomycorrhizae, and Shannon will tell you about that. It's an association where the fungus is wrapped around the outside of the plant's root rather than actually penetrating the root. Their fruiting bodies include a lot of the large fleshy fungi, and a lot of them reproduce in the autumn, some of them in the autumn and the spring, and a few of them just in the springtime, like the sunshine amanita, for example. Then some of the fungi making these mycorrhizal associations produce underground fruiting bodies, some of which occur in the late autumn or the winter time. So it's very much dependent on the species, and you see actually variation even within a genus, where some of them will fruit in the autumn, some will fruit in the springtime, and some will fruit both times.
Yeah, is anyone, Amanda? Yes.
Right, Amanda's question is, can you over-harvest the mushrooms? Will you damage the fruiting body or the mycelium in the soil? Yes. The only study that has been done sort of on the west coast here that looked at that question compared chanterelle patches. This was done by the Puget Sound Mycological Society, where they harvested some areas every year by digging up the mushrooms. They harvested other areas every year, cutting the mushrooms off, and they left other areas totally unharvested. And what they found was no difference at all in the productivity of those areas going forth. The only research I've seen that demonstrates reductions in production of fruiting bodies in future years is where you're harvesting damages the mycelium in the soil. And the best example of that in British Columbia comes from the Nass Valley, where pine mushroom harvesters trying to get the absolute top rate number ones, which are the buttons, which are oftentimes partly buried in the soil. We're using rakes to actually rake up the organic material on the forest floor in order to find those buttons, which brought the most money. And that damaged those sites for the productivity of mushrooms. But in general, no, harvesting them doesn't reduce future years' productivity, and it doesn't seem to matter much whether you pull the whole mushroom out or whether you cut it off. So the question is, what about coral mushrooms? is it helpful to leave part of it behind when you're harvesting? And I know of no studies about that anyway. Given that it's usually described, the fruiting bodies of fungi are usually described like being like the apples on a tree, then logically it shouldn't make a big difference. But I've never seen any studies on it. I would say just be gentle in your harvests. So the question is, if I understand, if we cultivate some of these mushrooms on different substrates like bark mulch or rice or something like that, does it change the medicinal qualities compared with, say, wild harvested mushrooms? Is that? Yeah. And I'm trying to think now. I was talking with Robert Rogers about that. I think it's generally not a problem, depending, because these are decomposer fungi that tend to grow on a variety of different substrates. This is the fellow who wrote Fungal Pharmacy, and he was more interested, and I've seen a lot more skepticism expressed among people who just grow the mycelium rather than produce the fruiting bodies, because oftentimes it's fairly easy to grow the mycelium, but difficult to produce the fruiting bodies. And it is the fruiting bodies that have been used medicinally. The biggest problem with this seems to be with cordyceps, which the caterpillar fungus, it's a parasite of insects and some truffles around here. And the fruiting bodies have been used in traditional Chinese medicine for millennia for a whole host of things. But there's concern about the widespread harvesting of Cordyceps sinensis in China and Tibet, and whether the practice is actually sustainable. So people have been growing the mycelium, the fungal threads that produce the fruiting bodies, but without an insect, it's kind of difficult to produce the fruiting bodies. But you can grow up lots and lots of mycelium, and a lot of that is sold in the trade. And the question is, does that mycelium have the same medicinal properties as the fruiting bodies? And the answer in some cases seems to be no, they're different products. Okay, I don't know about fruiting bodies cultivated versus fruiting bodies wild harvest. I haven't seen much on that.
So I'm going to wrap up. I'm here with Andy. We're seeing if this is possible. Damn it. There we go. Thanks everybody from home. Thanks everybody from home who joined us this evening. This was our first experiment with a hybrid real world online with 2-camera endeavor, and I'm feeling optimistic. So from Cumberland Fungus Fest headquarters and the Cumberland Community Forest Society, we're going to sign off on the webinar, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much, Andy. That was amazing.